Hello everyone. Can you hear me okay? Right. Well, firstly, a warm welcome to all of you joining, those in person and also virtually. This is a session organised by myself, Rachel Carmenta, lecturer in climate change and international development at the University of East Anglia, and my friend and colleague Willie Daly, who's at the World Resources Institute in Indonesia. The session is called Scaling Up Justice and Social Equity in the Design of Fire-Free Peatland Governance. And as you're all aware, responding to the reality of pervasive peatland fires is an urgent governance challenge. Peat fires release disproportionate carbon emissions, incur inordinate damages to human health and well-being, and damage the economy. And further, and most importantly perhaps, some of the policies aimed at fire prevention have shifted the final burden of fire risk reduction onto local communities themselves, creating dilemmas related to justice and equity. So this session is going to combine some immersive content, some videos with some empirical work and some technological insights, and then finish with an interactive Q&A. And the geographic focus will be Indonesia, which is home to extensive peatlands and suffers near annual peatland fires. And really at the core of the aim for this session is to put the carbon narrative to the side and put people at the centre. We want to foreground the human dimensions and the lived experience of peat fires. And what we hope that will do is gain improved understanding of the centrality of a humanitarian discourse in the context of peat fire governance. We also hope that we'll gain together knowledge and insight on possible responses to peat fire, afforded through empirical insights, and gain knowledge on the potential role of crowdsourced data and technological innovation to informing transparent and improved peat fire governance. So to start us off, I'm going to hand you over to my co-chair, who is Willie Daly, and he's going to introduce two short films.
Thank you, Rachel. Dear COP participants, especially for this session, greetings from Indonesia. I'm Willie Daly. As you may already know, COP26 is our last chance to push for changes in the system for a better climate future. Climate change has affected all of us, especially the people or local communities whose lives depending on nature. Climate change greatly affects, for example, people's livelihoods, season cycles, or even ecosystem that increasingly vulnerable to fires such as peatland. All of these changes affect humans. Therefore, we need a real commitment, a real climate action, which will not only prevent the increase of Earth's temperature, but also place human well-being at the center of climate policy making. And there is no better way to achieve this than to listen to people's perspectives. We are going to watch people's life experiences living in the haze of peat fires in Indonesia. The first video was created by the Greenpeace, which presents the impacts of fires to local communities. And the second video was created by a documentary filmmaking group led by Bjorn Favre, which presents the desperations to control the fires. Hopefully through these videos, we can reflect on making climate commitments that's not only for the future, but also for the people.
Ya, kalau tahun 2003 memang baru kami pindah dari Jakarta waktu itu. Ya, kita nikah di sana, pindah lagi sini. Memang jarang asap, jarang api. Banyak beko-bekoan itu, pengeringan pun jadi banyak. Jadi disitulah sekarang ini, karena hutan pun untuk menyimpan air tidak ada. Nah, udah istilahnya, kalau musim kering ya udah langsung terangkatlah air itu ke atas. Nah, kalau dulu kan masih banyak hutan, bisa menyimpan air, melindungi tanah gambut ini. Kalau namanya masih gambut ini pun, kalau sekarang kita korek udah jauh tanah, air. Kalau dulu kita korek satu gini udah air. Berarti dia hanya memakan gini aja, tidak kena ke dalam. Kalau sekarang itu kan asal ada api, langsung makan ke dalam. Jadi cepat menyerap.
Sebenarnya di daerah kita ini, setiap tahun kami mengalami kebakaran. Nah, tapi tidak separah tahun ini ya. Kita temukan 2000 hektar kurang lebih ya. Dan rumah yang terbakar itu 4, rumah sekolah 1. Kalau kebun masyarakat itu kurang lebih 50%, 1000 hektar. Itu kita evakuasi sampai dengan tanggal 24 semalam. Kalau jumlah pengungsi sampai dengan sekarang itu ada 212 jiwa.
Kami di sini Pak, ya sebabnya kami lahan terbakar, ya rumah-rumah gitu juga ada yang terbakar. Jadi kami ya di sana nggak tahan lah Pak, banyak asap ataupun takut terkepung api, maka kami sini ya mengungsi lah, udah ada 9 hari gitu. Kehilangan ya terutama ya lahan lah, ladang. Yang kedua ya sebagian ada yang rumah, kehilangan rumah.
Kalau 10 tahun lalu ya, di sini tuh masih banyak pokok-pokok tinggi, sejuk kan. Sekarang habis-habis semua pokok-pokok, nggak ada lagi. Walaupun hujan terus ya, tapi begitu panas 3 hari, 2 hari saja panas sudah kering, mudah terbakar. Nah, ini ya karena disebabkan pokok-pokok nggak ada lagi sekarang nih. Tanah itu tak lembab, kering. Ya, dulu saya nanam sawit sampai saya olah tanah itu kan sudah begitu besar, berbuah pasir, harapan udah ada ya. Tapi tiba-tiba habis terbakar, nggak ada lagi. Kata orang rumah cerita, usahakan lagi lah, olah lagi lah, tanam lagi. Berapa ada duit, nanti beli apa lagi, bibit lagi. Sekarang alhamdulillah kami udah tanam dah. Jadi kalau umpamanya terjadi lagi kebakaran, habis lagi, ya putuslah harapan, tak ada lagi.
Di saat itu api datang, ya kami mencoba mematikannya bersama anak-anak 3. Air susah, pakai air gambut lah gitu. Tahu-taunya gara-gara kencang angin, api pun asap, campur semua, kita nggak sanggup. Ya, semua pun jadi habis lah gitu. Ya, memang air mata menetes. Cuma karena bukan kita sendiri yang kena, hampir semua yang kena, kita pun berarti ini semua bukan hanya aku aja, berarti ini ya apalah aku bilang.
Bapak ini berantem sama api sendiri. Nggak ada alat berat, pakai apa ya alatnya?
Bapak sendiri jadi saksi.
Bagaimana apa sistemnya? Pakai apa?
Oh, iya Pak. Ayo cepat kita. Ada selang lah.
Kalau selangnya itu masuk.
Ayo elah mikir teh. Urus ini aja. Yuk. Mohon maaf Pak, kami membersihkan ini. Ya, masukkan di dalam koran Pak, supaya Jokowi melihat kita bekerja.
Nampak hampir setengah hari ini sudah. Pas dibawa angin cepat Pak, cepat dari kita lari sekalinya. Itu mesin kompak kita ada, tapi tidak sempat kita pasang mesin kompak. Air minum tidak ada. Habis, nah itu habis air kita. Kalau tempat tanah dia tidak mau lagi Pak. Sedih nih melihat yang seperti ini. Menjaga alam kita ini jangan sampai habis.
So those films are a snapshot into the struggle of those living through the toxic haze and the struggle of managing the fires without the right equipment to do so. And there are only two stories, thousands more exist, as we heard earlier in Pat Faisal's presentation. The idea of showing these films is really to try to bring us all to the same starting point and put people at the centre of the discussion around equitable fire governance. And to do that, we have a very interdisciplinary panel who are going to showcase their empirical work, which ranges from studying the impacts of toxic haze on health, including mental health burdens of peat smoke exposure, to environmental governance, and the potential contribution of technology and innovation to enhancing justice and equity and transparency in peatland management. So the panel that we have is Professor Dominic Spracklin from the University of Leeds, School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. We have Prof. Diki Pulapesi from Universitas Indonesia, Faculty of Psychology. We have Willy Daeli, who's the session co-chair with WRI Indonesia, and Agiel Prahoso, who is research analyst with Pantau Gambut. And myself, who I'm Rachel Carmenta from the University of East Anglia. The organisation of the session will be 10 minutes per presentation, and then if you could please think about your questions and save them to the end. For those of you online, you can post your questions and they'll be fielded by Willy, and I will take questions from the floor. There'll be a roving mic later. So please either post your questions as they come to you in the chat and Willy will collect them, or note them down now because we'll have questions at the end. So for now, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Dominic Spracklin, who will give his talk.
Thanks, Rachel, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? Brilliant. So today I'm going to talk about two main stories. First, a new assessment of the public health impacts of Indonesian peat fires, including the impacts of long-term exposure to that toxic haze. And second, an estimate of how peatland restoration could reduce those impacts from peatland fires. And most of the work I'll talk about today has been done by my colleague Laura Keeley at the University of Leeds. So as Rachel introduced to us, peat fires we know have major impacts. They release large amounts of carbon dioxide, and that has major impacts on climate change. Of course, they damage forests and plantations and agriculture, as we saw in those videos. And they also emit large amounts of smoke and toxic pollutants to the atmosphere, and exposure to those pollutants causes us long-term health damage. And the World Bank estimated that the fires in 2015, which were some of the largest fires that the region has seen in recent years, caused $16 billion in damages, but that estimate excluded the costs of long-term exposure to that smoke and the long-term health impacts of that exposure. And so the aims of our work were first to make a new estimate of the costs of peatland fires in Indonesia, including those costs due to that long-term exposure to peat fire smoke, including those health impacts. And second, to explore how peatland restoration could potentially reduce the incidence of fire and reduce those costs. And so to do that, we established this framework, which took inputs from a wide variety of different sources. So we used land use data on the locations of forests and plantations and agriculture across the region, satellite data on the size and location of fires, and through combining those together, we could look at the area burned of different land uses across the region. From information on the location of peat fires, the type of vegetation that was burned, but also information on the moisture content of the peat, and that's very important in determining the depth of peat burn into the peat. That allowed us to calculate the CO2 emissions from the fires, but also really importantly the air pollution emissions from these fires. We then combine that information with a regional air quality model, and that allows us to estimate the exposure of people to that pollution haze. Combining information on that exposure with information on health response functions, how people respond to that exposure to that toxic haze, we can calculate the pollution burden, the disease burden due to that exposure. And finally, we put all these different impacts together into the same metric using it and turn that into an economic cost in terms of US dollars. And so because the bit of work that we added on top of the previous estimate from the World Bank was this estimate of the air pollution and the impacts of that on people's health, I'll talk through that in a little bit more detail. So first we estimated the pollution emissions from the fires. As I mentioned, that was taking information from satellite, both on the locations on the fires, but also importantly this peat burn depth. That information went into the air quality model, which allowed us to predict the distribution of air pollution at both high temporal and spatial resolution. And so what I'm showing here is the concentration of PM2.5. So that's this very fine particulate haze, fine particles, which cause us the majority of the health damage exposure to that smoke. Of course, this is a model simulation, so we're very interested to make sure we evaluate that simulation, and we can do that against a range of measurements across Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore that allow us to demonstrate that the model is able to simulate realistic concentrations of this haze in the atmosphere. And so what's shown on the left now is the number of people that are exposed to poor air quality from fires between 2004 and 2015. And so we can see that even in relatively low fire years, between 20 and 30 million people across the region are exposed to really poor air quality, to dangerously poor air quality. And in the very large fire year in 2015, more than 60 million people were exposed to dangerously poor air quality. And through combining this information with these exposure response functions, we can estimate the damage that causes to people's health. And so we estimated in 2015, exposure to this air pollution caused just over 40,000 premature excess mortalities. So that's slightly lower than the number that's often cited for that year. Sometimes you hear up to 100,000 deaths. And our number is slightly lower because we use a slightly less sensitive concentration response function. So we assume that people are damaged slightly less to that air pollution than that previous studies. But we see over this region, even in years with relatively low exposure to pollution, relatively low amount of fires, up to about 20,000 people per year are dying prematurely due to exposure to that smoke. We then combined all that information to make a new estimate for the economic losses and damages due to these fires, and that's what's shown here. So in 2015, we estimate that the fires caused $28 billion US dollars in losses and damages. So that's higher than the estimate from the World Bank, which was $16 billion. And that's higher because we've included that very large cost due to that long-term health impacts from the fires. And over this entire period, we've simulated here over 90 billion US dollars in losses and damages. And that's a really large amount. It's between 1% and 3% of Indonesian GDP over that period. But importantly, and I think what we'll hear more about later in the session, is we've very limited information here on how those costs are distributed across society, so who in society experiences the greatest burden of those costs, and that, of course, is very important. The second part of the story, we're interested in how peatland restoration could potentially reduce the risk of fire and then reduce those costs. And so we know the Peatland Restoration Agency has been tasked with restoring 2.5 million hectares of degraded peatland across Indonesia. And so we wanted to know what the potential of that could be for reducing these damages. And so we know that fire risk is strongly dependent on land use and land use change. So this plot here is showing that areas of degraded peatland experience about 60 to 150 times the amount of fire compared to pristine, undamaged peatlands. And so at the moment in Indonesia, we're at very early stages in terms of trying to restore peatlands. There's not very many areas that we can use as a kind of to show us what the potential for peatland restoration could be in reducing peatland fire. So instead we used protected areas across Indonesia as a proxy for how peatland restoration could reduce fire into the future. We think that's a good proxy because protected areas on peatland are still exposed to a lot of anthropogenic pressures from fires. They're still exposed to drainage from surrounding areas. And so maybe they give a good indication of what could be the future in terms of restoring degraded peatlands. And what this shows here is the reduction in fire frequency in protected areas compared to surrounding regions. We find that over the protected areas experience between about 40 and 80% less fire than nearby unprotected regions. And protected areas are also tend to be wetter than surrounded drained regions. So if we combine this information with the framework that we used before, we can estimate what the reduction in fire would be if we had restored 2.5 million hectares of peatland prior to the fire season for each year. So for example, in 2015, we estimate that if we'd been able to restore 2.5 million hectares of peatland prior to that fire season, we would have reduced the costs of fire by $4 billion in that year. And across this whole period, we would have reduced costs by about $8 billion. So that's about a reduction of costs of about 8.5% over this period. But very importantly, again, we don't really provide any information on who would benefit most from that peatland restoration and that reduction in fire, or who would also bear the burden of that peatland restoration. So the benefits of restoration scale with the area of peatland that you can restore. So this plot here shows how the reduction in CO2 emissions from peatland fire could scale with the area of peatlands that you can restore. So 2.5 million hectares of peatlands is about 20% of the degraded areas of peatland in Indonesia. But a larger area of restoration would give greater benefits. And so I'll leave this my summary here, but I think I'm out of time. So I'll pass on to my next speaker, which is Diki Pulpesi from University Indonesia. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tom. I will put up my presentation. Okay. Can you see my presentation? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diki Pelupesi. I'm from the Faculty of Psychology at the University of Indonesia, or Universitas Indonesia. Sorry, I have a time glitch. Stop. Yeah, my name is Diki Belubesi. I'm a faculty of ecology at Universitas Indonesia. I'm also head of the crisis and social intervention at the same university. It is a privilege really to join the session to present some of the results of the study that I conducted in 2019 and at the same time of the 2019 health crisis in Indonesia that reached the peak of the crisis in late September 2019. I put up this title shortly for Unnoticed Effects of the Health Crisis in Indonesia. Perhaps now you have a question, why is that? I hope I can give you the answers as I go through the slides of my presentation. Dom has explained quite comprehensive about the impacts of the health crisis, so I will not go into details on this slide. But yeah, actually in this slide, I put a question mark on the mental health effect of health crisis. That is so far, I would say, understudied or unnoticed in a way that if we compare it with another impacts of health crisis, and you can check, I did check it, that studies on physical health impacts of the health crisis, such as on lungs or respiratory problems, babies or children's health status are more common or easier to find. How about the impact of the health crisis on mental health? That's basically my main question, and I would like to share with you the result of my study. Also come questions to me is the psychological or behavioral aspects of health crisis. When people try to make sense of their experience, when they try to figure out why it happens. The focus of my study on the 2019 health crisis. It's when the haze blanketed some parts or many parts of Sumatra and Kalimantan Island, Indonesia. And this is how it looked like at the time. As you can see, this is the news from The Guardian 2 years ago. And yes, Dom explained it before, the impact, the effect of the forest fire and the health crisis. And this is to summarize why I put the questions in my presentation title. That, as I know that the body of scholarly work on land fires and health crisis in Indonesia does exist, but yet study or investigation into mental health effects and psychological aspects of the health crisis and especially the 2019 health crisis in Indonesia is very rare, is scarce. So these are the aims of my study, to assess mental health effects of the crisis, the health crisis, and assess people's perception of the causes of the 2019 health crisis. And this is a brief description on the method of the study. One of the key aspects is that I recruited adult participants from the 3 most affected provinces of Riau, Jambi, and South Kalimantan. And I use this instrument called Peat. I use it to assess mental well-being of the respondents. But I should point out to you that PHQ-8 is not a diagnostic tool. This is rather a screening tool. So this is the socio-demographic of characteristic of the participants, the socio-demographic characteristic of the participant. As you can see, more than 80% of the participants, they experience a severe health crisis, another severe health crisis in 2015. And in these slides, we know that most or majority of the respondents perceive that the haze crisis they experienced was so severe and extremely severe. And majority of the respondents felt that the crisis has disrupted their work and also their family life and their spare time. In this slide, we see that almost 8% of the respondents experiencing severe depressive symptoms, and in total about 25%, so it's 1 in 4 respondents of the study experiencing either moderate or a severe depressive symptom. And this show the 3 most reported symptoms, that they are feeling tired, they had a sleep problem, and they had a concentration problem in the last 2 weeks, over the last 2 weeks. Besides asking questions, they experienced the symptom in the last weeks, I also asked the extent they experienced some of the symptoms in the last 3 days. And this is quite interesting study that what are the root causes of the health crisis? From this survey, this study, I found out people perceive that ignorance and greed as somehow the root causes of the health crisis. And this show how people perceive who parties that they thought are most responsible for causing the fires and also the health crisis. This study shows that people perceive local government as the most responsible in causing the health crisis, and the next responsible actor is central government. And this study also, we found out that dry season is not seen as the main cause or factors. And to summarize, and I put out points as insight here for thinking about fire-free peatland governance based on the study that basically I look at the human aspect, the psychological aspects of people who experience the fires and also the crisis. I would say that fire-free peatland governance needs to address both tangible and intangible, both risks and consequences of the fires and also the health crisis. And I think that complexity of fire-free peatland governance requires also to deal with the human aspects of those most affected by the incidents of the fire and also the haze. And I'd like to point out that responding to people's perception and expectation is also key to driving people or communities active engagement. And we know that there is part of the fire-free peatland governance. And last point that I would like to point out, I would say this is an insight based on the study. Fire-free peatland governance requires those who hold regulatory powers, governments, to deliver. And they need to deliver to meet the people's expectation. So that's what I would like to share with you all. I would welcome you to have a discussion in the later session. Thank you for your attention. And now my colleague Rachel Carmenta will present. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks for that talk, Dickie. Really interesting to hear about your work. So this talk then is what policy mixes can deliver fire-free outcomes, empirical insights from Riau, Sumatra. So as you may know, one of the ways of thinking about peat fires is as a wicked governance challenge or a complex environmental issue. And, technical hitch. And some of the ways in which that manifests, for instance, in relation to the peat fires, is there is really no clear problem definition. Different stakeholders think about the fires in different ways, incurring different burdens and also benefits from the peat fire system. And so even just thinking about fires as a problem isn't that straightforward. In addition, the solutions, which are many proposed solutions, take a long time to evaluate, and so it's not clear what will really work to reduce peat fires. And intervening in peat fire governance often has ramifications across sectors and can then lead to domino effects, creating other types of problems. So it's really not straightforward, and this is why we see the persistence of peat fires over years. And we know from a whole lot of academic work, for instance from Eleanor Ostrom, that there is really no such thing as a policy panacea. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, and instead policy mixes are likely part of the solution. But nevertheless, panaceas are still tempting because they're simple, they're scalable, they can be efficient, and of course they can capitalize on economies of scale. Another key characteristic of peat fire governance, as we heard in earlier presentations, is that they really need to focus on prevention. And that's because of the particular qualities of the peat substrate itself, which is flammable. And so unlike mineral soils, the peat soil itself can burn and catch fire. And those fires can actually smoulder going down along the coal seams inside peat and re-emerge in other locations. And huge quantities of water are needed then to put these fires out. And regular sorts of fire management practices that you might find on mineral soil farms don't work to contain and control peat. So it really has to be a focus on fire prevention. And if we're talking about policy mixes, we did a study actually looking at the different types of peat fire management interventions that are relevant to Riau, Sumatra, which is a hotspot of peat fire. And we found, in fact, there is a diverse catalogue of interventions that already exist. We found 60 different FMI, we call them fire management interventions, and they include a whole different range of strategies, from incentives, for instance, the Fire-Free Village programme, which I'll talk about later, technical solutions such as canal wetting, regulation and enforcement, as well as institutional changes. For instance, the inauguration of the BRG or the Peatland Restoration Agency. And these different interventions are led by different proponents. So we have industry, government, and civil society creating different responses and interventions to peat fire. And yet we see the persistence of the fires, which are now near annual events. So what we wanted to do with this work was ask the question, well, what policy mixes? If policy mixes are necessary, then what policy mixes work? And we studied the Fire-Free Village, which is an incentive-based programme, or widely known as an incentive-based programme, which has encountered variable success. So in some villages it's worked, and in others it hasn't worked. And in that way it provided a unique natural experiment to have a look at what conditions performance. So we compared villages with fire, where fire had been reduced or eliminated, and those villages that continued burning. And the Fire-Free Village is a private sector initiative, essentially to protect standing plantations from fire in the landscape. What's nice about this is that it's a standardized approach, and so there are 5 different policy interventions that happen, which are the policy mix, if you like. And that is a conditional reward, which is a considerable amount of money given to the village if fire is reduced, and even more if fire is eliminated over that year. A fire warden who is responsible for promoting the programme, speaking to households and enlisting members. Agricultural assistance, which can be technological support even in terms of machinery to clear land without fire, as well as seedlings and knowledge on planting horticultural species without the use of fire, and fire awareness, which happens in the schools, raising awareness of the health burden of peat fire smoke. And that's coupled with an air monitoring system, which is set up in the villages, so villagers can monitor the air quality. But what we also discovered through this work was the 6th policy arm or intervention type, which was the fear of sanction. So when the program is introduced in the villages, it was introduced in the presence of army and police, which created a sort of awareness of the illegality of fire and had quite an effect, as we'll see later. What we wanted to do then in this study was both look at how these different policy mixes had an impact on fire occurrence, but also what the role of the landscape context was in that. And we used qualitative comparative analysis, QCA, which was a technique to identify both the proximate, if you like, the intervention types and the remote conditions or the landscape context. And I can talk more about that if anyone wants to talk about QCA. And we classified the 6 different interventions as incentives, sanctions, and awareness raising. And then we classified the different landscapes in which the fire-free village had been rolled out in terms of low fire risk and high fire risk. And we wanted to see which combinations of policies would work in the low fire risk versus the high fire risk landscapes. So low fire risk were those places where there was not a lot of peatland, the dominant soil type was mineral soil, where livelihood diversity was large, and where mostly the land had already been planted by agriculture. And on the flip side, we had high fire risk landscapes where dominant soil type was peat soil, livelihood diversity was low, and not a lot of the landscape had been planted to agriculture. And the key finding that we found was context matters. So in the lower fire risk villages, where people had more diverse livelihoods and land was already being farmed, and it was mostly mineral soil, only one of those 6 policy interventions was actually required to secure fire-free outcomes, and that was fear of sanction. The incentive had no impact. We found a different set of interventions were needed in higher risk landscapes. So these were places where people were predominantly reliant on oil palm with limited livelihood diversity. There was a large extent of peatland, and much of the land was still not planted, so there was an incentive to clear land for agriculture. And in those places, there was more than one policy that was needed, both the fear of sanction as well as raising awareness of the health implications, whilst yet still the incentive had no impact. So the key message then is not only that context matters, but that deterrence and sanctions seem to be more effective than the incentive. That's not to say, of course, that deterrence and sanctions should be therefore used to mitigate peat fires, because that creates equity dilemmas and questions of justice, especially if fire-based land management alternatives aren't available. But rather, we need more research to understand what incentives then would be attractive and would motivate behavioural change for local communities not to use fire in these landscapes. And of course, saying that, though, it's important to also make the caveat that local communities are not the only people using fire in the landscape. There are many other stakeholders using fire at different scales. And of course, there are scales of culpability that travel across nations because of chains of supply and demand for oil palm, for example. But nevertheless, site-level intervention does have a role to play, and thinking about what incentives could ignite behavioural change is important. Thank you. And now, that is the end of my talk, and I will pass over to Willie Daly, who's giving his virtual presentation next.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm sharing my screen. Hi everyone, I'm Willie Daly with WRI. I would like to present our research on human dimensions of fires, reflection from a study in Indonesia. So as you may already know, human-caused fires became recurring phenomena across Indonesia in recent decades, and many small-scale fires have cumulative impacts and can spread quickly throughout the landscape due to degraded fire-prone condition exacerbated by changing climate. And the severity of mega fire events prompted the government of Indonesia to initiate a number of policy responses including policy on fire risk provision that has impacted fire user local communities. And given its impact on communities, there's an urgent need for a better understanding of the social and ecological challenges related to fire risk behavior. So fire-based agriculture has been cornerstone of agricultural practices in Indonesia and elsewhere in the tropics. For the communities, it is critical for local food security and low-cost land clearing, and its use is potentially threatened by fire policy. Therefore, it is important to have an understanding of the perceptions and preferences of the communities on fire use behavior in agriculture and natural resources management. Because it can generate new knowledge that could inform more equitable, nuanced, and targeted intervention and policy in different landscape contexts. Now, how to understand how people think or understand the world around them is through a mental model framework. So mental model is an organized collection of knowledge in individuals' mind. So the structure of knowledge in the minds of individuals is the basis for forming assumptions and understanding a phenomenon or system. And mental models are formed and constructed through the experiences that individuals go through during their lifetime. An understanding of people's mental models can help to identify context-bound common ground, and it is also useful to reveal the patterns of individual or groups of individuals' knowledge structure in a socio-ecological system. And next, how to elicit people through mental models. One way to do it is through 3CM method. 3CM, or conceptual content cognitive map, is a sorting cards method. We conducted 3CM method to reveal the current snapshots of communities' mental models. We asked the participants to group and categorize the cards that are considered relevant to answer the prompt questions related to fire use behavior. After that, we follow it up with in-depth interviews. So we conducted studies in 2 provinces in Indonesia, Riau and Kalimantan. We used 3CM to collect data into peat communities in Riau, 2 mineral soil communities in Kalimantan. We interviewed a total of 120 participants, and the participants were selected through purposive sampling based on their livelihood, roles, and gender. So the 3CM data were analyzed with a high cluster analysis using Anthropic software. A visualization of multi-dimensional scaling or MDS plots were identified and combined with interview results. As you can see on screen, there are MDS plots in the form of clusters that represent knowledge structures on their mental models. The numbers represent the cards that were used during 3CM data collection. So we found at least 3 clusters in communities' mental models related to fire use behavior in Riau, access to market and peat commodities, and the fading of traditional practices and rituals in peat management, and also lack of knowledge and infrastructure to manage sustainably play roles in how they perceive various activity. While in Kalimantan, food security, consumer practice, and identity and local institution in fire management play roles in how they perceive the importance of using fire in agricultural practices. So despite all the differences, both are bound by one thing in common, namely the lack of alternative. Although there may be alternative implementation from the relevant government agencies, the implementation still needs to be developed better. And implementing a one-size-fits-all policy like burn ban doesn't help at all. So what can we learn from this case study about justice? We learned that contextuality is super important. We need more research that focuses on trying to get in-depth understanding about fire risk behaviors, and researchers and government should work together to formulate a better version from comprehensive understanding of the complex socio-cultural system. Also, talking about justice in fire-free governance means talking about nuanced and targeted intervention. So future interventions should focus on interconnection between livelihood decision and socio-cultural reality that shape the mental models. An intervention that is well implemented in one context or one landscape may not necessarily be implemented well in other places with different characteristics. So providing intensive assistance to local communities in implementing programs is also important to generate favorable outcomes in dealing with fires. The last one, which is fire-free governance, it means we need to avoid one-size-fits-all policy. So policymakers must seek to understand current local realities and to be taken into account when making fires policy on when formulating interventions for fire-free practices. And the regulation should also be developed from the bottom, from the local. And the laws and the regulation on recognition of indigenous community or local communities is deemed to fail without the buy-in from the communities themselves. So it need to be developed from the bottom. So I think that's all for me. For more detailed information, please access our publications. Thank you for your attention. Next, my colleague also from Pantau Gambut will present his findings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Will. Good afternoon, all. My name is Agil Prakoso. I am a research analyst from Pantau Gambut, and today I would like to present our lesson learned and experience about community-based independent peatland monitoring for equitable peatland governance in Indonesia. Okay. So first thing first, what is Pantau Gambut? We are an independent initiative. We are a coalition consists of 24 local NGOs across 9 provinces in Indonesia. We try to enable and empower code-based independent monitoring of Indonesian peatland restoration progress, and we also try to promote general peatland management for reduce carbon emissions from deforestation. So we are coalitions. We produce findings. We use reliable data information, and we present our findings through our public platform. We have website pantaugambut.id, and we also have social media, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. So why Indonesian peatland issues matter? As we know, as also mentioned by the previous speaker, 2025 fire season was the worst since after fire in 1997. It burned about 2.6 million hectares, which is 35% is on peatland. After that, the government of Indonesia tried to strengthen the regulation, especially about the peatland protection and management. And also the government tried to build an ad hoc organization called BRG, or Peatland Restoration Agency, to restore the degraded peatland on the province across Indonesia. Unfortunately, 4 years later, on 2019, areas are burned again. 1.6 million hectares, forest and land fires, which is 31% peatland were burned again. And this number is as big as 2015, to be honest. But still, the effect from the fire, the peat fire, contributes to emit some carbon dioxide and also greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Research show that the fires contribute to 480 ton carbon dioxide per hectare. We've already know that the government has some commitment, and we already know that some company or concession holder has a commitment, sustainable commitment to peatland. However, unfortunately, we don't know how is the real condition, what is the progress and what the exact data that shows that the restoration has achieved the target. So we here in Pantau Gambut, we try to produce that finding. We combine two activities, and investigation and campaign into one product, collaborative product, data-driven product, attractive and adjustable. So we combine two things. We combine remote sensing technology and crowdsourced data from our community, from our network across 9 provinces that I mentioned before, to support our monitoring activity. So this is our flow activity. We use 3 inputs for our data information. We use publicly available data from the government of Indonesia. We use also the data from the research. And we also highlight some important points from Peatland regulations in Indonesia. Finally, we also use the reliable field information from our network. And 3 of data is analyzed using reliable tool. Here we use the remote sensing by spatial analysis to be produce some initial analysis. And those initial analysis is used a network in the 9 provinces to verify what happened. Is it in our initial analysis, it's really happened in the field or not? And then after that, field findings are baked into the digital content to be presented on our social media, to our Instagram with the attractive content. And also we try to report our findings and present it to our website. And also we try to have a dissemination with the related stakeholders such as central government, local government, or maybe related stakeholders such as session holder from the targeted investigations area. So while using remote sensing, as we know, remote sensing is an effective and efficient way to monitor vast area of peatland area in Indonesia. And we realized that remote sensing is not enough. So that's why we need to verify the initial analysis that we've been done before through our network in the 9 provinces. And since 2017, Pantau Gambut has conducted several research, and this is our current activity. We try to investigate the breaches by the consent holder on peatland. Why this is important? Because we realized that the government in Indonesia has an ambitious target to restore the peatland area in 5 years, and most of their target is on the concession area. However, there is no the reliable information about how we can track the progress, how we can know further information about the successfulness of the restoration activity in this concession area. So we monitor we firstly do the initial analysis through remote sensing technology, and we verify on the field. You can see as a result on the finding, the burn area that is identified through the satellite, it is verified on the field. There is no restoration activity in the burn area of one company. And then you can see on the bottom left, we also find that the protected peat functions area is utilized for extractive cultivation plantations. So there is a land clearing activity on the bottom left picture. And then after that, lastly, we also find that the ex-burn area in one of the company in the Riau, there is no effort for the restoration activity. But however, we found that the area was planted with oil palm plantations. This is also our ongoing activity. Is a collaboration with the WR Indonesia. We try to monitor the asset program that is currently happening in Indonesia. For your information, currently Indonesia have an ambitious target to have a food asset program to respond the warning from the FAO about the food security, food crisis during the pandemic of COVID-19. So we want to make sure whether this project is not again implemented within the peatland area like in 1997. So the bad impact will not occur in the future. And the result from our one of our sample points, we found from the remote sense that there is the land clearing activity detected from the GLAD alert during January to July 2021 within the protected ecosystem function with the depth between 1 to 2 meters. However, we don't know whether this is the land clearing for the activity or it's only the clearing by the daily activity by the company or maybe by the society. So we need to have the further verification for this initial analysis then. And also, we use spatial analysis to determine the pattern of peatland fire during 2015 and 2019 in 7 provinces. And the research shows during of time, the fire occurs on protected peat ecosystem functions. So apart from the technology, we also utilize code-based data, like I mentioned in previously. We utilize the data from our network, but we realized that we need to extend more the source of the data. So we have 2 pilot projects on the Jambi and Central Kalimantan. We try to enhance the capacity of youth who live on the peatland to be a peatland campaigner, so they can provide us with the reliable data, so we can analyze more. So you can see on the left picture, this is the report from the our Mata Tapak campaigner. They report us about the incident of forest fire in their area, and then we can and we can forward this information to the related government. And if they also provide us with the locations, we further can verify through our initial analysis using remote. So to conclude, peatland degradation leads to major environmental and social impact, as we may aware of this, and that's why it needs the strong commitment of multi-stakeholder for achieve the rehabilitation goals. So here, Pantau Gambut will still continues to assist and to monitor about the progress of restoration of peatland in Indonesia. Thank you. Back to host.
Thank you to all of the speakers. It's been a really interesting session and lots of different content. I think some of the sort of resounding sound bites are that context matters, impacts are diverse, impacts of fires are diverse and differentiated between stakeholders. So the experience of those, depends who you are. And I think in this final presentation, hearing about novel and new ways of using open access crowdsourced information to monitor and to bring liability even to transgressors of peat monitoring, peat management rules and regulations. So thank you to all of the speakers and to everybody who's still with us. If you could take a moment to think of any questions, I think there will be a roving mic which will be passed around. If anyone has a question for any of the speakers, they will all be able to then respond to you. And Willie will be collecting any questions that appear online. So for online and virtual participants, please post your comments and questions, and I can hand over to Willie, who will then share them for the panel to respond. So I think we've got one first question on the left.
Hi, I'm Michael Brady from C4. I'm curious if you looked at another maybe additional factor in peatland management is agricultural mechanization. And I'm wondering if that's something that you looked at as linking that to fire. I know from my experience in South Sumatra, where mechanization has now come in to wetland areas, it's had a major impact on agricultural burning. But I'd be curious if that was something you looked at. Thanks.
Thank you. If any of the virtual panel want to respond, please raise your hand so I know who to pass it to. I would like to mention, just in the context of the Fire-Free Village study that we did, it was an interesting program, and one of the interventions in that mix was support for cultivating the land, or at least converting the land to production through the renting or lending of a tractor. So through that machinery, so there would not any longer be the need for fire. And so when I first learned about the program, I thought that was really interesting, because of course that's a massive need. If there's no fire, then how can you convert the land into agriculture for production? But what was interesting was, in fact, that part of the program couldn't really be utilized well, because the company was up against extremely opaque land rights. And so if villagers couldn't show their definite title to the land, the company was worried about lending the machinery to clear the land because of, you know, the liability of clearing the land of which the ownership was unclear. So it was an interesting problem in the context of that problem, because of course machinery would be a fire-free alternative, but yes, it couldn't really be applied because of this opaque land tenure, which, as you know, is a big issue in Indonesia as well. But perhaps any of the panel or Dom have any response to that one? Otherwise, we can take another question. Oh, I don't hear.
Hello, I'm Nike Doggett from the Tanzania Forest Conservation Group and also from University of Leeds. My question really is, can agriculture ever be sustainable in this context? We hear from Dom the high economic costs, we heard from Dicky the high mental health issues, and that we've heard from you the importance of fire in the agricultural system there. So what is the solution in terms of providing for the livelihoods of the people who are living there? Thank you.
Any of the panel want to take that question? Did you hear the question well?
Yes, we have similar question online.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think to answer that question, first of all, we need to have an in-depth understanding of how peoples or local communities using the fires, and also we need to get rid of the one size fits all people, and we need to try another approach that more flexible, that can be accepted by the local communities, but at the same time we need to provide them with assistance for alternative livelihood that of course fire free. I think that's all from me. Do you have another to add, Rachel? Or another? Yes, please, Agil.
Adding for Willie, I think the current challenge why people still using agriculture for their plantations, because it has a value compared to some people, some peatland communities still have a lot of marker, for example. So the current challenge that need to be addressed, I think the government need to like Willie said, to make training for them to always cultivate the free fire communities, and also the government should provide the market so they can change their behavior for planting the agriculture plantation that destructed the peatland area to another adaptive peatland community, for example, like the polyculture communities. I think the role of the government is really important here.
Thanks everyone, and for those thoughts. I think, well, you're right, it's a massive challenge, and any of the more sort of transformative types of interventions being proposed for peatland management are also the most controversial. So we did a study looking at perceptions across different stakeholders and how they thought about the different intervention options, and those truly transformative, sort of, you know, cancelling licenses, for instance, on peat and agriculture on peat, are the ones which are confronted with the most conflict, and stakeholders think extremely differently about what should be done. And so I think part of the solution is at least dialogue and evidence, and moving towards, you know, solutions which perhaps are a form of compromise. But I think what's really key in that, and what we sort of wanted to stage in this session, is really how people should also be at the centre of those conversations, because the current situation on peatlands with the fires incur incredible damages, you know, which do go beyond the carbon and the environmental damages, but also the lived burden of that. And perhaps that's a cornerstone of powerful language to discuss the need for change and more sustainable practices. But exactly what the solution is, I'm not sure that anyone here has the answer. Perhaps Michael has an answer. His hand is up.
Well, I'm going to say something that's probably not very palatable. There are examples in Indonesia of peatlands that have been completely burned over. Peat is now gone. And some of these areas, not all, but some are quite successful agricultural areas. We look in South Sumatra and in central Kalimantan. There's some very large agricultural activities. A lot of these are ex-transmigration, where fortunately the land tenure issue is resolved. So it'd be very interesting to look at these areas where burning has taken place extensively. What's happened to people there? I think you'd be surprised. There are some actually good stories. I've been looking at a location in South Sumatra for 36 years. The peat is completely gone. Agricultural potential is very, very high now. Again, this is not very palatable, but it is worth looking at. Thank you.
Does anyone have a response or reaction to that? I saw, Dom, your hand was up earlier. Did you want to?
Yeah, maybe I was going to say more in response also to Nike's question was, I think even if you can in a peatland landscape move to quite a fire-free system, if you don't restore the hydrology, you'll still have fire, because even if there's very scant number of ignitions, if the peat is very dry, those small number of ignitions will light the fire, will light the peat. So I think restoring the hydrology is really critical, and as your work has shown, that's a really difficult thing to do. And also, if you don't restore the hydrology of the peat, even if you don't have fire, you'll lose the carbon during the dry season when you just get oxidation of the peat during the dry season. So even if you don't get fire, you'll lose the peat over time. So yeah, I think it is a challenge.
Yeah. Any other questions from the floor? Or Willie, do you have questions there from the virtual participants?
Yes, we have one question for Pak Diki. The question is, did you manage to look into the location of survey participants, for example, rural or urban and distance to fire hotspots?
Yeah, thank you. Short answer, unfortunately, no, because the study was actually during the peak of the crisis, and mentioned in my slide that actually what I did was doing an online survey, so it was difficult to track where the participants, the respondents came from. So yes, no, the answer is no.
Thank you, Pak Diki. We also have another question, but for Agil, the question is, since many peatland fires are located in remote areas, are hard to access, is that crowdsourced data limited only to fires that are close to settlements or outside? Agil.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, we have a limited access for some peatland area to monitor, especially in the remote area. So for our monitoring activity, we mostly prioritize the area that recommended by our network, because they are directly contacted to the society also. So they might get an impact from the activity of the utilization of peatland. So we firstly prioritize that area that is being recommended by our network. So currently, we don't have any further monitor to the remote area for the field verifications. Okay.
Thank you, Agil. We have another question for you. The question is, the food estate program seems to include deep peatland and protected forests as well. How this affect government cooperation in protecting the peatland and forests, and how to avoid the degradation of these deep peatlands areas affected by the food estate program?
Well,
Please, Agil.
okay. The most highlighted answer for this question is the government of Indonesia highlighted that the food estate will not be implemented on peatland area. So we as Pantau Gambut are still try to convince their commitment. And if that happens, it means that the government has break their commitment to the peatland protection. And we want to campaign that issues to the public that it might be happen again in the incident in 1997 if the government still use the peatland area for their food estate activity. For food estate activity be implemented on the peatland area, but with term and conditions, and also it only can be implemented in the shallow pit conditions. With the conditions of it is not as deep as more than 3 meters or below 3 meters. So it means it has some term and conditions to implement some activity, food estate activity within the peatland area. But here, the things need to be highlighted. The government has already been stated that the food estate will not be on peatland. So we will bring that commitment to our to be monitored. Thank you, Willie.
Thank you, Agil. We still have time for online question, Rachel. Okay. So we have a question for you, Rachel. The question is, the ban of using fire for clearing the farming field has affected farmers, including those who do not live on peatland area. Many of them scared to start farming, and this greatly affects the food security of local people. What do you think is the best solution for this?
Thank you for the question. I actually also think Willie would be a great person to respond to this, because that's partly what he covered in the study that he spoke about, how the burn ban impacts farmers farming on mineral soils in Kalimantan, Dayak farmers. But I think that really the central sort of response is that context, and fire types really matters, and often fire gets conflated as one thing which is all the same. And of course there are many different stakeholders using fire in different ways, some of which have been using fire over generations for a very long time. In Sweden, agriculture on mineral soils, and then the peatland landscapes are being cultivated by different actors, in recent decades, using fire at different scales and on a different substrate. And so it's really important, actually, not to conflate the distinct types of fire and those different stakeholders using fire for different purposes, some for food security in intergenerational land management techniques, and others for commodity crops, in a newer context and new ecologies of fire as well, of course. So I think that, unfortunately, back to the point, which is one size doesn't fit all, and all these distinctions do really matter. And unfortunately, that means we need complex policy responses. I say unfortunately because that's obviously more difficult and less easy to scale up, but nevertheless imperative. Thanks. We have a question here in the room, so I'll hand over back to in person.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Steedman from BSI and ISO. It's a very interesting area, and I was just wondering whether you're working with international standards to develop any solutions that could be scaled across the world of good practices. Is there international standards work going on, and if not, we can sort that out?
Well, over to the panel. Everyone has a chance to respond if they would like to. But from my perspective, so far as I know, No, not for peatland context. And there is different studies I know looking at fire management windows, for instance, temporal and climatic conditions under which different burning strategies can take place. But I'm not aware of that being conducted on peatlands. I don't know also if Michael might know or the panel want to respond, but it sounds an interesting area to explore, although, I suppose there would be a trade-off between what's possible to implement in many different contexts and what needs to be context specific. But okay, well, we have a comment from the floor.
Do you want me to comment?
Yeah, sure, go
Yeah,
ahead.
There are very long-standing, I wouldn't use the word standard, but certainly agreed guidelines on integrated fire management, accepted sort of globally, but as you say, not for peatland. My view is there shouldn't be fire standards for peat. It just should not be burned, and there should be no recognition of the need or intention to burn peat. So I would be very wary of a standard for fire management in peat. Maybe a fire prevention standard, yeah. But globally, there's lots and lots of guidance on integrated fire management. Thanks.
Well, I'm going to offer the opportunity for any panelists to ask a question to one another before we wrap up. And perhaps I could ask the first question, if that's okay, taking the liberty of being chair. I wanted to ask Agiel, could you talk about how your platform is used by, a bit more about how your platform's used by different stakeholders? And you mentioned some litigation cases. I was curious, is it receiving a lot of uptake, or is it still not too well known? How do you see the future of the potential of Pantau Gambut?
Okay, thank you, Rachel, for the questions. So, we to promote more about our platform, we Pantau Gambut also have ever like the event with the journalists, so they we give a brief introduction about our platform, so they can further know how to utilize our data, our findings to be published to their news. So mostly we give them the tutorial how to access the publication, how to monitor the report from our platforms, how to track the commitment that has been tracked by our team related to the Peatland. So for the public, we never have any like the event or training for utilizing our platform, especially the website. But I think it's quite easy to digest all the information from our website itself, because we are showing the finding, the publications, not showing like the progress of something like the government platform. So I think it's quite easy to be accessed.
Thanks. Do you want to, yeah, over to Dom. Final question.
Yes, my question was, we haven't heard much about climate change in this panel. So I was wondering how we thought climate change might impact fire in this region in the coming decades, but also how responses to climate change and climate change mitigation could reduce the potential for fire as well. So that kind of two-way process.
Well, actually, well, I think it has a correlation, like long correlations, because by campaigning the activity for protecting the peatland to tracking the progress of peatland, it also gives the public awareness about how peatland is really crucial, how the peatland ecosystem is really crucial to store carbon, how by protecting the peatland will not releasing the greenhouse gases to give further impact change. So our long-term goals is to related to climate change is by giving public awareness that peatland is an important ecosystem that needs to be protected. So that addition, so that's why if you can check in our Instagram account, we try to promote our findings. We try to give a campaign to the public with the attractive content, with the digestible content. We try to give light information. It's really crucial to be known by the public.
Great, thank you, Agiel. Right, well, with that, I think we will wrap up. We have come to time, and thank you all for the presentations, and thank you everyone for your participation and your questions to the panel. Happy to take any, to chat after if anyone wants to come and speak with us. And the online presenters are also available, of course, via email to connect with. So thank you, and yes.
Thank you.